So thank you all for being here. The life-affirming work we are gathered here to do today, the life-saving work you will do when you carry this experience into the fullness of your own lives, the life-affirming and life-saving work that people who use drugs, it's sacred work. Drawing from my own Christian tradition, I know it to be the work of the gospel, a gospel of love and liberation, a gospel of harm reduction. Believing the gospel message to be one of healing, justice, and liberation, I understand that this healing justice lies as much, if not more, in the language we use, the stories we tell, the gestures we offer, as much as in the policies we craft, the programs we create, and the doctrines we preach. As people of faith, we are obligated to see this moment differently, to use the lens of our faith to offer an expansive and challenging vision. So in this way, while it is true we are in the midst of an overdose crisis, we believe that at its core, the overdose crisis is fundamentally a moral crisis and a spiritual crisis. A crisis that fails to recognize the full humanity of our beloved who use drugs, which condemns and criminalizes people who carry their burdens and joys in ways unfamiliar to us or perhaps beyond our ability to understand. A crisis that redacts and fractures and reduces people created in the image of the most divine to behaviors, pathologies, and renders us, them, less than human. Most significantly, a crisis which fails to recognize the divine in people of color, which terrorizes Black and brown communities through brutality and murder called policing, threats of deportation, separation of parents and children, not just at the hands of ICE, but at the hands of legal and family court systems, which have for decades determined that drug tests, income, and legal system involvement determines the quality of parenting. This has devastated families. In thinking about how to co-create relational space which fosters love and liberation with people who use drugs, and which challenges the dominant narratives around overdose, substance use, and the people who use them, we began our journey by listening into the stories people in our communities were telling. We heard from Terrell that he longs for a spiritual community which allows him to show up with his whole self, which recognizes in him a complex history of overcoming and a deep desire to co-create sacred space which is inclusive of his communities and loves. We heard from Father Victor that his 3 parishes in Western Pennsylvania have been reeling from the loss of beloved young men, friends, fathers, and sons, families too ashamed to name the cause of death, suffering in silence and struggling to craft theologies, which challenge the church's moralistic views on substance use, agency, and sin. We heard from Tony that he desires a community which will ritualize his joys and loves, which will celebrate his love for his fiancée and welcome them into community through a marriage ceremony in a church. We also heard he does not believe that any church will have him or them because of how they manage their pain and what they choose to put in their bodies. We heard from Emily in the city of New York that there was want to construct a ceremony that honored the over 1,700 lives lost to overdose in 1 year alone, and which recognized that people who use drugs are often afforded the dignity in death that they were not in life. We heard from Reverend Tilley that her community of faith in the South Bronx has long been devastated by overdose, hepatitis C, by incarceration, and that they are struggling to tend to the legacy of trauma while stemming the current bleed. Give voice and action to the fury that their pain, their experience, has been criminalized, brutally policed, or ignored, while their white neighbors to the west are being wrapped in resources, in funding, in compassion. We heard from Marilyn that as a woman of deep faith, she longs to be an architect of liturgy that speaks to her, which is born of stories that look like hers, which explicitly includes and not others. We heard from Frank that his role as a pastor of a rural congregation means he is often a first responder, that the continuum of care begins in his congregation and in its membership long before considerations of problematic substance use, addiction, questions and care of treatment arise. We heard from hundreds of people following a sermon on the gospel of harm reduction that they had never heard the drugs issue talked about with compassion from within a sacred space, that they had never heard their story reflected with love from the pulpit, that they had never heard themselves, their children, their lovers called beloved. The most compelling thing we heard from most and from many is that they do not hear themselves called by name, that the stigma of substance use has crafted a chasm between community and connection. And it's actually in precisely this place that I connect my story, and I'll share just a bit. But first, the word of God for the people of God. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. My call came on Thursday, January 2nd, 2003. It began with a knock on the door, a reluctant shuffle, a wrestling match between my dope sick hands and a doorknob, and the eventual recognition that my present hope lay with the woman who stood on my stoop, Sydney. Sydney, deep dark brown and doe-eyed Sydney, ever generous smile wrapping all in her warm. Sydney the beauty, clutching a box full of items she had stolen from me. Still Sydney the beauty, and now in a process of healing Sydney. Transformed Sydney. I hadn't seen Sydney in years, a parting of friendship like scores of others, crafted by incarceration, by overdose, by death. To be honest, I had forgotten about Sydney. I had forgotten a lot. It was a purposeful forgetting. It was my escape. Escape from pain, from trauma, from the shame, from the stigma, from supporting myself by whatever means necessary. Forgetting was my escape and dope was my forgetting. I had forgotten Sydney. Sydney had not forgotten me. Sydney spoke. She spoke of dope, of sick, of pain she called her own. She also spoke of hope and of healing. She spoke her broken body up against mine. Sister to sister she spoke, I will be with you. She spoke of freedom from the bondage of shame, of stigma, of self, of freedom from the bondage of the need to forget. I went to my first meeting that Friday night. I went to my first meeting because I was out of dope and also because I was tired of doing what I did to get by. I went to my first meeting because Sydney had gone before. I went to my first meeting on that Friday night because the fear in me and of me outsized the hope I had in the world. I went to that first meeting because Sydney went with me. Whenever I deliver the full sermon this is drawn from, I debate at some length whether I'll begin the message in this way, not because I imagine my story is one that people have not heard or experienced, nor because I'm apologetic about the incredibly resourceful ways I crafted and employed to move myself through trauma to surviving, but simply because it is stigmatizing. Drug use, being a person who uses drugs, is in a relationship with a person who uses drugs, is in a process of negotiating their relationship with drug use, is deeply stigmatizing. Drug use, chaotic use, addiction, the myriad of ways in which people carry their burdens and their joys are deeply stigmatized. Hiding one's whole self, the inability to truth tell in church and community, in relationship with self and the divine, is an incredible wound. Stigma is the crisis, not drugs. Whole people created in the image of the most divine are redacted and fractured, reduced to behaviors, are made other. While a great number of expectations are placed on people who use drugs to change their behaviors, their drug use, the structures that make some people more vulnerable to drug-related harm, the social context that creates and reinforces drug-related stigma that leads to status loss and discrimination is rarely explored or further challenged. The powerful manifestation of this wound limits access to opportunity and rights to stable and healthy housing. It ensures under and unemployment. Stigma prevents people from seeking and completing drug treatment and from utilizing life-affirming healthcare services that might reduce the harms of drug use. In a vicious cycle, stigma drives people underground. Come to me, all you. Come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Come to me with all of you. This is an invitation into relationship, to connection, to the inclusion of you in the all. For people who use drugs and the people who love them, this connection, this inclusion, this invitation shaped by compassion and loving regard for the fullness of one another's humanity is the embodiment of harm reduction, is the expression of radical welcome, the welcoming of all stories and paths. It calls people by name and attends to and cherishes the particularities. It is a hospitality that seeks people out, meets them where they are, and invites them into loving community. I knew that I was welcome because Sydney welcomed me. She welcomed me through story, through her own vulnerability. In this way, it is our obligation to make intentional space in our pulpits, in our relationships, to make sacred space which invites people, all people, people who find themselves at the many margins, people who are creatively, desperately, intensely, and faithfully struggling to find ways to carry their burdens. It is our obligation to make space for people to tell their stories, be their stories, and to tell and be their whole stories, to show up with their whole selves. So how do we do this? How do we begin to break apart drug-related stigma that people who use drugs might be freed, that you and I might be freed? Connection and conversation is how we will do this. So let's. We'll begin by posing 3 questions to one another. First, what is drug-related stigma? And how has it touched your life? 2, how is stigma maintained? And 3, how can we begin to dismantle its power over people and with people? So with this, I would love to pass to my colleagues, Alexis and Michelle, who will say a bit about who they are and how they're connected to this issue and work, and address this first question about what is drug-related stigma and how has it touched you?
Good afternoon. I was going to say morning, but I guess it's not morning anymore. My name is Alexis Pleus, and I'm the founder and executive director of an organization called Pharm. It's in upstate New York, but we do have a national reach. You can find us online. And I founded the organization as a result of my experience losing my oldest son, Jeff, to a heroin overdose in August of 2014. And so how stigma impacted our lives is literally what drove the reason why I do the work that I do and founded the organization that I founded. When Jeff was alive, Jeff suffered from substance use disorder, addiction, from the point that he was a junior in high school until 8 years later, without our family knowing at all. So he was fully addicted to opioids, which began with a prescription. It doesn't really matter how it began, but that's how it began. And then progressed to heavy recreational use, and then problematic use, and then he developed a substance use disorder, and then he could no longer afford the pills. He switched to heroin and injection heroin use. And I was oblivious. You would think that you would know, right? We have a very close family. Jeff finished high school, went to college, graduated from college, had his own job, had his own apartment. We stayed very close to his family. So it's not like we were out of touch. We were very much in touch. But he was, functioning just fine. Until 2011, I got a phone call that he was arrested for burglarizing houses. And I couldn't believe it. So of course I was proclaiming his innocence and insisting there's no way my son could have done this. I met with the public defender, and I'm going to use a word I don't like only because I'm repeating what he said, but I said, this doesn't make sense. My son closed the restaurant that night. He has a full-time job. Like, why would he burglarize houses? And the public defender said, a lot of things heroin addicts do don't make sense. And that was my announcement that my son was addicted to heroin. And addicts is the word that I don't typically use, just repeating him. So when I met with my son, afterwards I said, Jeff, the public defender said this thing to me. He said that you're addicted to heroin. And the flood of tears just came out of, like shot tears out of his face. He sobbed and cried and said how he had been suffering for so long by himself and hadn't asked for help. And I asked him why, your mom, you come to me for anything. Why wouldn't you have asked me for help? And he said, I was so embarrassed and so ashamed. I was so afraid to bring shame on our family. And I realized, that was our family's doing, right? The way that we talk about substance use, the way that I would say, don't you hang out with those kids or don't do those things, that it set up this situation for my own kids that if they had their own challenges, they wouldn't even dare talk to me about it because of the way that we as a family had continued to stigmatize drug use, just like our society stigmatizes drug use. Moving forward through our lives, then that was 2011. So then we spent a considerable amount of time trying to get Jeff the help that he needed, which is very difficult to do. We don't make this easy in our society, and we also make the type of help that people receive really challenging. And as I was going through this, I'm a structural engineer. I work in an engineering firm, and I was not silent about it. Like, I didn't think there was any reason to be silent about the situation. I had a coworker who's wondering if you can move the mic a little bit away from your mouth. Oh, is it really? Okay. Yeah. Usually the desire.
Yeah,
Okay.
It may help to see too if you move it out of the camera so you have your mouth so that people can see what you're saying.
Good point. Okay, thank you so much. How is that?
Much
Are
better.
there messages online?
I just saw a chat.
Yeah,
That came up on the chat.
Is it better now?
Mhm.
Okay. So then at work, and I was telling Erica this story last night, I had a coworker whose child had leukemia, and my son had substance use disorder. And for that family, there were fundraisers, there were meal trains, there was empathy, there was care, there was sympathy, there was love. And for my situation, there was people would not know what to say to me. They would be silent. They would say, haven't you told him to stop? All sorts of, yeah. And the final thing that really caused me to stop talking about it was my boss said, we really are sorry for your situation, Alexis, this is awful. But work is not the place to air your dirty laundry. And so that's what my son's condition was referred to as the dirty laundry. And then moving forward, Jeff's, we lost Jeff in August of 2014, so only 3 years later. And in that course of time, Jeff had been incarcerated again, and then got out and was in recovery for 20 months before he used again and lost his life. In that span of time, part of his recovery was he became a born-again Christian, and he was very committed to his faith. So when we lost him, I wanted to honor him in the way that he would want to be honored. I'm not a churchgoer myself, but I wanted Jeff's life to be honored the way he wanted. And so in the days of trying to find a way to lay my son to rest, I had to meet with churches to try to find out which church wouldn't make my son seem like a horrible person. And that was a real process. You know, people wanting to use the word junkie or addict or sin or moral failing, and none of those things were acceptable to honor my son in his passing. And so that entire experience of both life and death is what caused me to start the organization Truth Pharm to try to work on stigma. And so I'm thankful to be here with you all today to tell these stories and to talk about how we can have solutions to make sure that other families don't have to go through this. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mathis, and I'm the executive director and co-founder of Olive Branch Ministry, a faith-based harm reduction agency set in the rural Appalachia foothills of North Carolina. When I got started, I'm trying to think of the best way to start about how stigma really has affected the work that I do. I got started in harm reduction through my work with HIV, being a community volunteer, tester, and educator, and I was the health and wellness minister for my congregation that I served in. And I served in a ministerial pastoral role for 12 years within our congregations and our denominational congregation in my hometown. And throughout doing my HIV work, I often did HIV testing in the fellowship hall after church on Sunday, or we had a recovery program. It was Aspen State's recovery housing program and reentry program. So whether you were fresh out of rehab or fresh out of the gated community, you had a place to stay at our church, and you could come and go to 12-step meetings, find support with substance use disorder, abstinence-based recovery, or reentry from incarceration. So our folks were at high risk of HIV and other infectious diseases. So the ministry that I had there was very welcome. We would do HIV testing. We even did HIV movie night, where we would have a movie and bring folks in and then talk about HIV afterwards. And it was well embraced, fundraising events, everything was great. When I made the radical switch to harm reduction with syringe exchange, I tried to talk about that one Sunday from the pulpit and got sat down. It was okay for me to say, hey, y'all, I've got condoms in the trunk of my car. You know, if it was bootleg, you'd come out, you know, after church on Sunday, come get free condoms, and the line would be, you know, around my car to get free condoms on a Sunday. The first time I tried to say I have free injection supplies, I got sat down. So then I had to have a discussion with my pastor, who himself had been a 20+ year active heroin user. He spent 20+ years incarcerated in the penitentiaries in New Jersey because of substance use disorder. He was very familiar with the work that I was doing, but it wasn't okay to talk about in church. So I worked through that disciplinary process. But one Sunday I was sitting up with the other ministers and the ministry team, looking over the congregation. And I realized that the people that I was called to serve would never feel welcome in that congregation. And it wasn't that the church wouldn't welcome them in, because when I say all are welcome in our church, everybody was welcome. It didn't matter if you were gay, if you were straight, if you had, you know, were a sex worker or a former sex worker, if you were a person with substance use disorder, it didn't matter. You were welcome by the congregation. But every sermon was about abstinence-based recovery, whether it was testimony time, or the songs that we sang, or the messages that were preached, or the Bibles, every time somebody always popped up and said something about, their anniversary, right? Or, I'm fighting the enemy today. And, I'm glad God saved me from whatever. And all those are beautiful messages. But when you have people who've been experiencing church trauma, you want a place where they can come in and feel welcome and not have the trauma that they believe they've experienced thrown back up in their face, right? That's a barrier to care. It's what we call it in the clinical system, but it also is in the religious world, right? You don't want those barriers to be there. And so I heard a sermon that Bishop Eva Thunder, who I'm listening, if you haven't heard her speak, you need to hear her speak. But she preached a sermon once that talked about two priests that were brothers, and they were called into the tabernacle tent in the desert along with the other priests, right? And they were all worshiping, and these two brothers said, no, we have to leave the tabernacle and go and take the worship to the tent. And I took that as an affirmation kind of my calling, that I'm not called to be in the tabernacle, I'm called to be in it. So that next Sunday, I didn't say anything to my senior pastor. I traded in my collar and my robe for my Converse and my ball cap. And I went and did syringe exchange in the Walmart parking lot in Granite Falls, North Carolina. And the guy that I met with, he said, what are you doing? Aren't you supposed to be in church at Sunday morning? And so I told him about what I had experienced the Sunday before and the realization that I had come to that. Even though I knew that the congregation would welcome folks in, that the folks I was called to serve would never feel comfortable because of the messaging that was told Sunday after Sunday. And he said to me, he said, thank you. This is the first time in 20 years I've been in church. And we were standing in the Walmart parking lot exchanging syringes, clean ones and dirty ones, and naloxone and wound care supplies. And there was no choir and there was no pulpit. It was simply two people who loved God, who found this common bond. And we created safe space without stigma, without judgment, just love. And because I removed the stigma from the situation, he was able to experience worship and God in a way he hadn't in 20 years. And that's when I got the affirmation and I made the right decision. I have never looked back. My pastor and I, since then, we didn't talk for a couple of years. But then he heard me speak for the North Carolina Council of Churches in our hometown. And you heard, if you were at dinner last night, Regina LaBelle mentioned that the clergy breakfast that the North Carolina Council of Churches. So I did one in our hometown and he was there. And he sat on the front row. It was one of the first really interactions we had since I left the church. And I told, my harm reduction 101, overdose reversal, this is faith and harm reduction, went through all of that. And at the end, we had a question and answer session. And one of my former colleagues, I actually had preached at this church before. He stood up in the back and he said, crossed his arms, and he said, Cheryl, you know I love you, sister, but you're condemning people's souls to hell by putting syringes in there. This is a room full of pastors I had served with on the Interfaith Council. I had been in their churches, they had been in my churches, we'd been on committees together, and that's what I was hearing in my own hometown from somebody that I considered a colleague and a friend. And my senior pastor stood up and he said, sit down, shut up, you know what you're talking about. Because the message had gotten through to him. That so much stigma surrounded the work that actually caused one of his ministers to leave the church, right? But that there was a greater work, and that by abandoning the stigma, by fighting against the stigma, and by creating safe space, people were able to reach God at a new level, whatever that God looks like for them, right? And make a faith connection, whatever that faith looks like for them, because the stigma had been removed out of the conversation. And he told his story about how he'd been stigmatized, right? And that was a revelation for him sitting in that space. So for me, the importance was creating safe space. And I knew, even though I loved my church, I'd served there for 12 years, there was still such an air of stigma around with substance use disorder that I had to remove myself and take church out into the fence.
You know, one of the pieces I heard you say, Michelle, which really kind of resonates with my own experience, is when I, back in 2003, and this was not the first time I had attempted to, you know, really find some sort of healing or healing path related to my own substance use, which at that time was very much disordered and chaotic. That I had no access to trauma care. I had no access. I hadn't heard or wasn't aware of. I actually was not aware of harm reduction at all at the time. And so actually the person who sold me drugs took me to a meeting that Friday night. And he was incredibly supportive and loving. And I found an incredibly just robust community of folks who shared a real desire to pursue wholeness and deeper relationships with self and others, and for me, as a long practicing Christian, with my God. And at the same time, I had the experience of noticing that so many of my friends and family members were not there with me. They were still dying. They were being incarcerated. They were being explicitly put down for the ways that they were pursuing healing. And so whether that be medication for opioid use disorder or whatever it be, hearing very clearly amongst this community that I had found incredible love and hope, and I still am very deeply connected and grateful for those experiences. I also was really keen to challenge the experience that I hear you talk about in that congregation, where why are we not celebrating all of the small kind of ways people are making positive change related to this notion we have a real, I mean, it's my understanding of the gospel and all of this is that we're about blurring these divides and boundaries with other folks, and that by, you know, really, I think stretching ourselves to you know, listen into the experience of others who may have a wildly different kind of vantage point on this. I went out on a syringe exchange van in Coney Island, New York, about 12 years into my kind of journey, which at that point was really marked by abstinence and 12-step fellowships. And I just remember sitting with this incredibly visceral discomfort that, you know, being part of, it was so contrary to what I had heard. It was about the drug, it was about me, you know, ensuring that I was not connected, but it's to have the opportunity to kind of bear witness to the wholeness of people's lives and really to hear about, you know, the reason why Jackie right now is struggling with access to care. She doesn't have a home. She doesn't have a home. She was just forced to sign over parental rights for her daughter. She's got no purpose. That was her purpose, and that's because she's on methadone treatment, and the particular judge system that she is part of in New York City does not recognize that it's a valid form of treatment, and so she is on the street. She has been now for almost 4.5 weeks again. And it's devastating. And so this will kind of maybe lead us into this next question about how the stigma is maintained I'm part of the ministerial team at Judson Memorial Church in New York City, and we consider ourselves a wildly progressive congregation. We may or may not be, I think we probably are. So we've been involved in, Reverend Howard Moody, who really kind of started launching a lot of these incredible efforts on the, Reverend Al Sharp and others talked about this compassionate clergy for compassionate just drug policy. Took root out of Judson way back in the day, and they were really, clear that they needed to be responsive to the material kind of experience their congregants were having, not just the spiritual, right, and religious. And so they started working with other harm reduction organizations. At that time, actually, syringe service programs were not legal in New York City. They still continue to not be legal in a lot of places across this country. The legalization of syringe service programs in New York is owed to a Episcopal priest named Father Luis Barrios, who actually lost his congregation and was put on administrative duty because the Episcopal Church did not believe. He said, I am respondent to a much higher law than this. I see my people dying. I see my people contracting HIV. I see my brother has been incarcerated and all of these things, and I'm not going to allow that to happen. And so he was really one of the ones who helped shepherd it. He's now in an incredible congregation up in Washington Heights and doing a lot of this work with us. But we had to start looking at some of the institutionalized culture. So we have been making safer injection kits and safer sex kits for people who use drugs in New York City. We don't keep a single one of those for our congregation. We ship all this out. We have made a really explicit assumption about who they are and who we are. And I hadn't even realized this. Had not even realized this, Judson, like a lot of churches, relies on rental space to kind of keep the ministries going. And we had at that time, I think, this relationship with HBO or Showtime, who was filming in part of our space. We had that same day, we're also hosting the New York statewide drug users union, who was holding their annual organizing event and celebration event to really kind of lift each other up. They're the ones who are on the front line doing this. They're the ones who are reversing all the overdoses and all of this. And we were told that we could not make hospitality supplies available to folks. We could not have syringe service boxes that were visible. We could, or disposal boxes. We could not have X, Y, or Z. And we said, you know what? And so what we did is we bedazzled every single syringe disposal box we could find. We bedazzled them with the words love and justice and made sure that they were exquisitely visible. And Judson now has one of the most remarkably robust, we're in the process right now of establishing ourselves as a registered opioid overdose prevention program, second-tier syringe service program. We have a congregation specifically that was led by, designed by people who use drugs and people who use sex work throughout New York City. And anyways, but it was really, so I wonder kind of what, in your experience, what helps or how is stigma maintained?
So we've touched on a lot of it, right? In these systems that continue to moralize substance use and drug use. But one of the ways that I think stigma is really maintained is this measurement of recovery and what recovery looks like and how it can only be defined one way. And also, one of the things that we talk about a lot at Pharm is how it's remarkable that our society really celebrates people who have never used drugs or don't use drugs, and really celebrates people in recovery. Like, we love to applaud for them. We hear the recovery date, we all clap. Somebody says they have 5 years in recovery, we applaud that. But everybody in between, the people who are still actively using, are like, their lives have no value, it would seem, until they get to recovery. Or we put all these measurements on, you know, so Truth Pharm is a harm reduction based organization, and some people will come to us and say, I completely agree with what you do. I think it makes a lot of sense to keep people safe and healthy until they can find recovery. And so the only way that that person has value is the potential future recovery, not the fact that they just have value as they are in that moment. And if we love them and accept them completely as they are in that moment, you know, they might never change their activities, but their lives still do have value. They still are a human. They still are a beautiful person. And we can't eliminate stigma until we're ready to take it to that level of pure acceptance, 100% accepting a person as they are and not expecting some future state. No conditions. We love you unconditionally as you are today, and that might be how you are forever. And if we love unconditionally in that way with no expectation of what you can change about yourself, that's when we will eliminate stigma, I think. And then the next question, we'll talk about other things, because, you know, the other issue that we have still, and I'll just touch on it for a second.
You can lead into that, because I want to say, we'll do that. We'll start kind of blurring these last couple of questions.
Okay.
I want to be sure that we have an opportunity to have a conversation with folks.
Okay. Well, so the other issue that we have, you know, is the fact that we are criminalizing substance use. And so it makes it very complex, right? Because people will say, like, okay, I understand everything you're saying, Alexis, but it's still illegal. So they're doing illegal things. So people like to point to that as the moral failing, right? So there is a deeper conversation, which is really difficult for folks to have, about the fact that we can all do this work to destigmatize, but if we're still going to criminalize, it's going to be impossible to completely remove the stigma. But we can start in our spaces to accept people and love people as they are unconditionally, without an expectation of a future change.
I think I have to put my glasses back on so I can read that. All right, so how is stigma maintained?
We're not going to be able to dismantle its power over people and with people.
Yeah. So our center in Hickory, we have 3 offices, and 2 offices are located in an integrated care clinic, meaning that there's detox or some other abstinence-based recovery program in the same building with us, whether it's outpatient therapy or whatever. But our holistic harm reduction center is located on a church campus in Hickory. And it was a process in working with the congregation. The pastor approached us and said, hey, I've got space for you. Actually, the same conversation I just mentioned a few minutes ago. She was there and she said, I've got space, and let's talk about this and what can we do with Olive Branch. It was amazing, and we embraced the space, and it's perfect for what we do. But the church had traditionally held AA, NA, and Al-Anon groups on that campus. And there were a couple of people in the church who said, we can't do this. We're sending mixed messages. If we have, you know, AA, NA, and Al-Anon, and then syringe exchange, are you kidding me? We can't do that. And what about the needles in the parking lot? What about people using dope on campus, or passing out, or overdosing in their cars? And we just say none of that has happened. And we've been there for 2 years. But it was a conversation that we had to have, right? And so the stigma was not only about people who use drugs, but about the programming that we were going to offer. And a stigma against harm reduction itself, because there wasn't a great understanding of what we do through that harm reduction. But there's another kind of stigma too that I encounter, and it's stigma that people who use drugs have against faith communities, right? And I can't just sit here at the table and not address that as well. And I think part of that is because of the stigma that they themselves have felt for a really long time, and the fact that they're not welcome, so they automatically make the assumption that faith communities are not going to welcome them either. There's a difference between having all are welcome on your church sign and all are affirmed. There's a difference between welcoming folks and affirming folks where they are. Doesn't mean you're going to like everything about them. You may not like, the way they dress. You may not like their politics. You may not like their substance use. But you can love them without judgment. You can affirm who they are as beloved people of God. And let it just start there, right? Like you said, with no end game in mind, just building relationship. So in the work that I do, I address the stigma from both standpoints. And part of that is the fact that in our space, on campus of a church, we don't evangelize, right? We don't have Bible verses everywhere. We don't ask, who your favorite deity is. We ask what's your substance of choice. So we don't ask about their religious inclinations or preferences, because we're trying to break down the stigma battle, right? The biggest way that we encounter stigma is simply, or I guess the biggest instances of stigma that we see is simply created because people don't know people who use drugs on a relationship basis. It's a transactional basis. Here, let me give you a bowl of soup and you can listen to a sermon. And that's a transaction, that's not a relationship. So the biggest way to break down the stigma is to have relationship without theology, but just build a relationship and get to know folks for who folks are.
And one of the pieces you talk about quite often as being kind of critical to this is the languaging. And I know this came up last night for those of you who were no, we don't have to do it this way. Catching myself is really odd angles. But no, it's. I mean, this continues to be. It's as a Christian, and kind of the belief that the world was spoken into being, right? And it's the importance of the sacredness of word, and so looking, for me, a lot of it has been really having to learn how to challenge my own internalized stigma, the stigma that I have really just absorbed. And I think you talked about it as well with regards to this criminalization. Like if we're talking about, if we're framing kind of misuse or a problematic relationship with substances as substance abuse. I mean, abuse is illegal, it's violent, it's all these things. And so what are we saying about people? And again, I know Tim talked about, this last night, that how he chooses to define himself and name himself comes from a place of being empowered to do so, but that we don't do that naming for other people, and that you can't have those opportunities to, to listen into, what other folks' language are. We don't have these opportunities for like relational connections and stuff like that. And so we've done everything from kind of doing audits around our services and our liturgies. And we advertise AA, MA. We also advertise the storage service program. We also advertise the harm reduction kit parties. We have health information up that is inclusive of people who are still using, and resources for the folks who really want to stop using, and to really just kind of normalize it and present a much more kind of expansive conversation about what's possible relative to people who are being touched by substance use. And what we've heard is by explicitly naming, we've got some congregations we've heard incorporate kind of marking the number of folks who they have lost to overdose in their community as part of a regular kind of occurrence of like, this is an issue that continues to live amongst us and live in us. And it's important that we create these, you know, ritual containers and spaces and places where people can bring this and wrestle with this and be in conversation with each other. And so inviting folks into congregations to have these conversations and, you know, explicitly naming some of the, you know, we're not looking for this big kind of triumphal, everybody loves the story of triumph and all of this, but what happens if we start looking at and celebrating these gradations of positive change and really finding ways to honor that. And so I'm aware time-wise where we are. Would love to expand the conversation. If there's folks online who have questions, folks here, I'd be happy to be in conversation with you. Otherwise, I'm sure these ladies will keep talking. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you all for being here and for sharing your stories and all the excellent work you guys are doing in your communities. I just had a question that kind of crosses all three of the questions you just addressed. We all know the importance of language when it comes to recovery, and some of the most, you know, I guess, successful, for lack of a better word, institutions like AA and I have been around for a long time. That word anonymous is still in there, and there's some sort of still implicit, like, don't tell anyone you're here feeling of anonymous. And I'm wondering how that might play. And we talked about how it's maintained. Is there any way of, like, maybe rebranding that somehow so it's not necessarily anonymous, even if it's an implicit anonymous, like keep it quiet that you're here or whatever, maybe someone might feel that. Like, I don't like how you think the importance of language is so key, how that might play a factor even in the most successful institutions that have helped so many people.
I'm so grateful that the folks in my life are not anonymous about their kind of relationship with, at that time, 12-step fellowship, which is where I found kind of my base in reorienting the way that I was engaged in healing from trauma and my relationship with substances. So thank goodness Sydney and my dealer at that time, Lonnie, who shared with me that they had found hope in this particular community. And so I think it's being explicit. I mean, one of the key pieces of, you know, really just my theology and my kind of orientation to this work is that those of us with lived experience of living experience of substance use need to be the ones who are at the table and leading these conversations. So finding ways to really kind of pass the mic to folks who don't otherwise get the mic and have an opportunity to, you know, gift our communities with the stories and the magic and their leadership and all of this. So our board of Faith and Harm Reduction is over 50% comprised of people with lived experience and living experience. The majority actually are currently still using. And that's critical. I mean, that's the only way that we're going to be doing is, you know, really finding ways to give folks an opportunity to listen into the experience of one another and boldly talking about this from, you know, it's just challenging the silence. I mean, what we say is just as important as what we don't say. And so really challenging the silences and being willing to talk about these messy, complicated, painful things in community.
I just wanted to comment. Anonymity is badly misunderstood. In the 12-step community, the tradition is we're anonymous at the level of public meeting. That's all. It's not a secret society. It's not meant to be that I don't share my recovery with you or with, you know, and so on. But very kind, you know, I will go off on all that.
But no, I think it's, I mean, you talk about that point where it's like, you know, principles over personality, and I understand that this is part of it, right? So that I don't discredit this entire kind of opportunity for connection and healing based on my experience with, you know, X, Y, or Z, and, you know, I understand some of that as part of it as well. And I think that what needs to happen is that, again, we are centering
at some point in time, it's got to be a turning point because the majority of us will have been personally impacted to the point where we can't judge others. We're all in it together. But sadly, that's not the way that we should have seen this change. You know, it's too bad that we can't just shed the judgments and make it so it's not that. But I also understand your point that it's the word is misunderstood a little bit in terms of how it's used by the group.
Yeah.
I want to mention a resource as well, since you brought up language. There's a resource online called the Dictionary. So if you're ever curious about what words add to stigma or what words to use instead that reduce stigma, it's a great resource online. But you know, talking about like removing the word abuse or abuser, that's a real tough one, right? And addict is it's actually a slang term, which is really what I think helps people turn around and not use that word anymore. It's not clinical, it's just a slang term. So not labeling people as addict is a great idea. And then recognizing recovery, people stop or change their use patterns sometimes without ever identifying as a person in recovery. And I think we have to accept and celebrate and recognize that as well. Not everybody takes a path that is viewed as like, I'm in recovery. I have 3 sons. I lost one. One also, my middle son also struggled with substance use. And he doesn't anymore. And that's how he refers to it. He doesn't refer to himself as a person in recovery. When we've had these conversations, he said he can't believe the pressure that his friends put on themselves when they identify as being a person in recovery. And he said, I didn't want that. Like, I just wanted to figure out how to stop using. And now I don't use. And I'm not going to put that label on myself because of the level of pressure that comes with it. And so I think even that conversation, identifying everybody who doesn't use as a person in recovery, even that can be damaging. Just recognizing people can change their use patterns or not use at all anymore. And we can celebrate that also without trying to force them into some kind of a label that even when you think about the term recovery, it's like, well, you were not good, now you're recovered. And I think it's fine if people want to identify as I'm a person in recovery, but recognize you don't have to put that label on every person who changes the way that they relate to substances.
Too, it's like I think about, you know, a point that you brought up earlier is for a lot of our folks too, it's necessary that they are silenced about their use because they're going to lose their kid. We make assumptions about, I myself was very open about being a person engaged in a long-term healing process with substance use as part of my ordination process. It came up over and over again where I was asked to define what that looked like, and it included substance use, if it included 12-step fellowship involvement, all these kind of things. I've had to take multiple drug tests to be able to be ordained and employed in my national denomination and all this kind of stuff. And so all these assumptions we have about people who use drugs and the ways that those are institutionalized, made law. Somebody at the meeting last night, you know, was working in corrections and was asking about, like, you know, this is just, it's not going to stop because we have entire, you know, multi-million-dollar industries built on the criminalization of people who use drugs. No, very much so.
It's a lot of answer for one question.
And if folks want, we've got some incredible resources in this toolkit. We're happy to make this available to you. We got a whole section on stigma and all of this. This is a toolkit that we made in partnership with New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and ultimately expanded to a national audience. So it's got some incredible resources for talking about and thinking about this work.
Is this for the next group and we're overlapping and being abusive of the time?
No, I just tried to switch devices so I could monitor and answer, invite people to ask, and I screwed it up.
Okay.
Questions from folks here?
Did we have online questions?
Here's one.
Oh, here's a question, if the toolkit is online, that I can access it.
Yes, so there are a couple different places. You can go to www.faithandharmreduction.org. It also is on www.harmreduction.org. That's the National Harm Reduction Coalition, and that's where the living document lives. So that's where the updated version kind of lives.
I hope I took that right.
In perpetuity. You can download the PDF for free. You can buy the actual hard copy, like I said, if folks are wanting.
It's faith in harm reduction.
Okay, let's try this. Trying. Yeah. Faith in, I-N.
Yes.
I didn't get
Oh, okay, but
Can I clarify too, which dictionary were you talking about? There seem to be 3 of them online.
Oh, it's called, you can go to Shatterproof. Shatterproof has that, but it's a dictionary with
They're all spelled the exact same way,
Okay.
so there's.
I think it actually lives in
Amazon book,
3
there's one
places.
by PCSS now, and there's one by recoveryanswers.org.
We also have a couple links out on our booth. We have a People Who Use Drugs flyer, which has all the national organizations, so everyone from SAMHSA down through, there's a glossary that was created by the Union of People Who Use Drugs. That's an incredible glossary around how to talk about substance use.
I'd have to look at the link that you're looking at, but I know when that tool was created, it did live in a few different places online, so it might be the same one across.
Well, there's at least 2 here. One of them doesn't look, one of them looks like the sort of helpful thing that you're suggesting, and one of them looks slightly less helpful.
The beautiful thing about the dictionary resource is that the terms, there's a ton of different terms in there around substance use disorder, but the highly stigmatized terms are actually asterisked.
Yeah.
And so you're able to pull those out fairly quickly. And there's alternatives that are suggested.
Here's the big challenge for me as a pastor in the congregation. We're talking about welcoming and all of that kind of stuff. We've got loads of 12-step groups that meet in our congregation, and there's an amount of public conversation and advocacy that I'm actually very proud of. The welcoming piece that you were talking about is the biggest challenge by an order of magnitude.
Yeah.
And I was very, very interested to hear you talk about the difference between welcome and affirmation, because I haven't really made that distinction before. What I've been talking about to the congregation is welcome is a little bit more like that radical thing that Jesus does to people who are in trouble, and a little bit less like here's your bulletin and here's how you behave well in our environment. And I'm trying to get a paradigm shift over to something that will help people to connect with other folks who are actually on the same campus all the time, and they're because they're looking for something, but there's just a complete disconnect, and it's all about this stigma.
It is, and leadership doesn't always have to start from the top down, but it's really helpful if it does. So I was looking for churches before I found the church that I had served in for several years. So I was visiting churches, and big sign out front, all are welcome. I thought, okay, I'm going to go in, and this is kind of where it began to click for me. I walked in, I sat down, beautiful music, beautiful sermon, and about halfway through, the pastor said, and I'm so glad that we have a welcoming church. We welcome prostitutes, we welcome drug users, we welcome the homosexuals, we welcome the people straight out of jail and straight out the streets. Now, I put a couple of those categories, and I'm not going to tell you which one, it ain't none of your business. Okay. But why could he have just said, we welcome all of God's people? period, right? We all, everybody, bear the thumbprint of God right here. And if we would look here instead of here and here and here, it would make a world of difference. But we forget about this, which is the most visible. The fact that we all bear this thumbprint, right? That's the difference between being welcoming and affirming. You ain't got to categorize people. You just say, well.
Right, we do have one more question from online. Please give tips on how to have a conversation with people who suffer from substance abuse disorder as having poor character, moral failing, so on and so forth.
Go ahead.
I think somebody from the get-go is like, and it's, so we're gonna plug, we've got a session coming up after this where we're going through kind of all the opportunities for our faith communities to engage, whether it be hospitality or community building or the advocacy and stuff like that. We're gonna talk a little more specifically kind of about the kind of values and foundation that underlies this work. And I think part of that is just being very explicit from the get-go that it's not a moral issue. It's not an individual issue. It's a complex psychosocial health and community care issue. And so being upfront, I've had the opportunity to be in kind of places of presence, whether that be the media or the press or whatever, and just leading with this. I think that's I know it's not my question, so I'm sorry if I'm staring again. It's incumbent on us to be leading that conversation and go to that.
And then the other thing that I would mention is it really goes to like what Michelle was mentioning, the same kind of thing, like of not putting labels or expectations or going straight at an issue, right? So the question that the person is asking, when we recommend to because we do a lot of education for parents and families and talking to them about how to talk to their loved ones. And so don't focus on the drug use, focus on their health and wellness. And so if you think about, the person asking the question, like we have a lot of conditions that are very similar to problematic substance use or chaotic substance use. All of us suffer from a lot of various conditions. If somebody came up to me and wanted to talk to me about my weight, I would be appalled. So why would we think that it would be appropriate to go up to a person and immediately talk about their drug use? That would be appalling. It's really, it's just such a, I think that we think with drug use, it's in this separate category that we got to go straight at it. We got to talk about this topic. We got to go right to that thing. But how about we talk about just health and wellness? And that's what we do at our organization. We treat people's health and wellness solely. We don't care. They can talk to us about their drug use or not. We don't care. Do you have a primary care physician? How's your health doing? Are you doing things that are keeping yourself healthy and well? How are your spirits feeling? Where's your mental health at? What can we do to facilitate wellness? And believe it or not, people will bring the topic up on their own if they want to, which is the much healthier way, because as soon as you say, I want to talk about your drug use, people will clam up, feel judged, and be upset that you approach that topic in that way.
We have 3 minutes left.
Okay.
I think our colleague, one of my most valued colleagues and teachers, and I think one of the most powerful ministers I've met is a woman named Louise, who runs the National Drug Users Union. It's called Urban Survivors Union, and they've got a couple different state-based chapters. And she often says my drug use is it's the least interesting thing about me. But it's what people go to. She has this is her wholeness is eclipsed. And I think that also is a real piece, is, in this reframe that we're talking about whole people and these really complex contexts, and we don't singularly, this is a really small facet of who folks are. And
Honoring humanity and autonomy is key to the whole thing, right? I want to know that I can have a trusting relationship with you, but if you don't see me as a whole person, not as a broken person, not as a diseased person, not as an addicted person, but a whole person, right? Whole and holy. You see that? We've got somewhere to start.
That is a perfect closing comment.